want to call it. There's lots of things going on. If you watched a soap opera or anything, or any story today, it would be similar. Everywhere you turn, there's problems, challenges, issues, everything. So we're going to hear more about that today. So in our Sunday school book on page 53, that's where we are. And page 53. In a moment, I'd like to get somebody to help me read Seeking the Context. But I'm going to read something else first here. So just a prelude to this whole thing. So way back, this was after David sinned. David took Bathsheba and he killed her husband Uriah. And Nathan confronted him. And that's when David repented. And the Lord said many things all at the same time. He had said before that his lineage would be the Messiah, and that was still going to be the case. That's a promise that the Lord made to David, and that promise was still going to happen. What the Bible says about you reap what you sow is also applicable. So for the things that David had done, the Lord said, you're going to be suffering with your family as a result of it. And so we've already seen that start, and it didn't mean the Lord abandoned David altogether, as he did with Saul prior to David. It just meant that David was going to have to see the consequences of what happened. So we saw that Amnon, which was the first son of David, raped Tamar, his half-sister. Absalom, who was his brother, told Tamar, which was his sister, full sister, to be quiet about it. Absalom then plotted his revenge for 2 years. Then he killed Amnon. He fled Israel to go live with his grandfather out of the country. He was gone another 2 years. Joab worked with Absalom. Joab hired an actor to come and tell a story to David. And the story convinced David to invite Absalom back to Israel, but he did not invite him back to the king's palace and back to good graces. And so this definitely had a negative impact with Absalom's attitude. Absalom burns Joab's field to get his attention. Joab appeals to David to bring Absalom back into the fold. And at the end of what we just studied, David kisses Absalom and welcomes him back, which is the opposite of how it usually works. Usually Absalom would kiss the king, but the king kissed Absalom, which is in that it showed a different than normal process because he was the king. Okay, so if somebody would like to read Seeking the Context on page 53, it's also maybe a quarter of page 54. Thank you, Sister Darla. So a lot of things going on. There's no good story in here. If you look through all this whole thing that we'll be studying, well, there's a couple of good pieces, but we're going to study about a lot of things that are that are kind of a mess. If someone would like to read 2 Samuel 15, 1 through 12, that will get us started. Thank you, Sister Doris. So who can help us understand what's going on here? He is making a move against David. He's taken all the steps. He's taken advantage of David's weakness. David is either concerned with matters of the government or wars or whatever, or it's just his older age. Whatever it is, he's not keeping up with everything. And so in this example, Absalom has taken advantage of that. First, he gathers up chariots and horses so he can make a big entrance pretty much wherever he goes, because now he is recognized as part of the royal family. And you may remember, Amnon was the oldest son, so he was the obvious next heir. But what happened? Absalom killed him because of what he did with Tamar, so now Absalom is the heir to the throne if you go by the next one in line. And so he's making some obvious moves, not just in the way of showing things, but just like Brother Jim said, he is meeting with the people at the gates of the city, and he's swinging their hearts his direction. He's saying, wow, this is a bad situation. We don't have a judge to take care of these things. Oh, if they just made me a judge, I'd help you right now, but I'm not empowered to do that. So this is what I would do if I was in charge, but since I'm not, sorry, not much I can do for you. And so then if we go over here to verse 6, and on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So up to a certain point, we saw where David was the king of Israel, and there was no challenger. There was no anything. David won every battle that he fought. He was obeying the Lord, and the kingdom obeyed the Lord as well. And so everybody was all serving the Lord. David was serving the Lord. All of his mighty men were serving the Lord. All the people were serving the Lord. Now things are not the same as they used to be. And so David's sin is known by everyone, and it's affected his ability to be an effective father. He has not taken the right steps with Absalom. He didn't take the right steps with Amnon in the first place. And so now we're just seeing the next things happen. Human nature and our sin nature is what's driving all of these things. In verse 8, he talks about, this is Absalom saying he wants to go back to where he was born in Hebron, and he wants to go back there, and he wants to go back and I guess worship the Lord. And so what Absalom is doing now is sending spies throughout all of Israel, aligning them so that when he takes over the kingdom, that everybody will align under his leadership. In verse 11, Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. So it doesn't really tell you here in much detail, but the men that Absalom took were the top men of David. They weren't the lowliest one. They were his primary advisors and his primary warriors, all those people. So what was the purpose of taking those people? Well, it was a show that he was part of the royal family and he had the support from David. But another one is sort of taking them out of action. He's separating them from David so that when he makes his move, they're not there to help David. So it was quite a strategic move on the part of Absalom. Then verse 12, we see Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. So who is Ahithophel? Do I remember? So this was Bathsheba's grandfather. Eliam was Bathsheba's father. If we think of the mighty men, which were the great warriors and fighters of David, one of those was Eliam, and I use the analogy of today of the Navy SEALs. That's pretty much how capable these guys were. And so Eliam was one of the mighty men, and his father was Ahithophel. Eliam was Bathsheba's father, and Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. He was David's counselor. He was the one that advised David on how to handle matters of the state, how to handle different situations. He was a very wise man. And so the fact that in verse 12, Absalom is sending for Ahithophel means he is sending for him to be part of this conspiracy. And so it's very well known who Ahithophel is. You might even think there might have been some planning prior to this or some discussion about some potential alliance. We don't know that. We haven't seen anything in the Bible that tells us that. But you sort of get that idea. Because of what David had done with Bathsheba, it wouldn't be surprising that Ahithophel had an agenda to try to figure out someday how he was going to get back on David. Okay, so that gets us up to verse 13. We got so many verses to cover today. Okay. Let's see, if somebody would like to read, oh, this is a lot of verses. Okay, how about 13 through 29? If somebody could read those, that would be great. Thank you, Sister Helen. That was a lot. Okay, so we saw the actions Absalom was taking. Now we're seeing the actions that David's taking. So at the beginning of this, in verse 13, a messenger came to David. The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom, meaning he's going to make a run to become the king. David, he may not be the best ruler. He may not be good at handling people's grievances and all those sorts of things, but what's his biggest strength? He was a soldier. He knew how to fight. And what did he do when King Saul was reigning and King Saul was after him to kill him? What did he do? He ran. So you could say David was an expert on how to run, how to get away. He was an expert at getting away from every bad situation when he was under Saul. So he had a lot of experience on how to have a large group get away from another group. It's could be simple things of how to hide your tracks. It could be things of how to be deceptive, how to make somebody think you're going to go one direction, you went another direction. They even hid in a cave that when the King Saul was looking for him, but King Saul had no idea they were even in there, and all the forces were in there. So David was really good at running. So we saw this happen. Verse 14, David said, "Let's go." In verse 15, and also his agenda too is to get out of Jerusalem. The last thing he wants to see is Jerusalem destroyed as a result of a war. And so that's another part of his thinking is let's get out of here and figure this out. And so in verse 16, and the king went forth and all the household after him, and the king left 10 women, which were concubines, to keep the house. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So the king went on and talked about in verse 18, 600 men. So it wasn't a trivial amount of people that went with David. It was a good amount of people that went with David. And then in verse 19, we see Ittai the Gittite was deciding to go with David, and he was saying, "Oh no, you don't need to go with me." And he says, "Yes, no, my place is with you." So this is pretty significant, because remember, all of David's key men are with Absalom. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know that they were being taken to Hebron for some other agenda. They were just following instructions. So now David is taking the people that he has. No doubt that Absalom didn't count on Ittai staying with David. You can almost count on that he did not count on that happening. Mm-hmm. Right. David didn't have his head right on what was going on at the time and what was the threat to the kingdom and all those things. He most definitely was still he was loving his son, caring about his son, but his son didn't care anything about him. And that was definitely a problem for not only David, it was a problem for the whole kingdom. And so in verse 23, we see that all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over the brook Kidron toward the way of the wilderness. Then we start seeing about Zadok. So who's Zadok? We studied about them a little bit a while back. Who's that? It's in verse 24. Yeah, way back when we were doing all the movements of the ark, remember, there were specific things that had to be done, and the only people that were allowed to touch the ark were only specific people that were from a certain family. And so David realized he was doing it the wrong way, and then he engaged Zadok and the priests that were part of the right group so they could transport the ark. So here they were in verse 24, bearing the ark of the covenant of God, and they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had done passing out of the city. Okay, and the king said unto Zadok in verse 25, "Carry back the ark of God into the city. If I shall find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me again and show me both it and his habitation. So you remember back when Israel used the ark like a good luck charm? They took it into battle, said, "Oh, let's get the ark." What happened in that situation? It was disaster. They lost the battle, and the Philistines actually got it, and they had it for a little while, and they gave it back because they didn't want it, because the Lord wasn't blessing them with it either. Okay, so the significance is these priests are going with the ark, but then there's something we're going to see here in a second, where David takes advantage of the priests and their loyalty to have them acting as spies on his behalf. We're going to see that in a second. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Would somebody like to read verse 2 Samuel 15:30 through 37? Verse 37. Thank you, Brother Homer. Okay, so we got a lot of things going on again. In verse 30, David is not only on the run, but he is also grieving. He's grieving the whole situation with Absalom, what's happening. He's got his head covered. He went barefoot. All the people with him did the same. And he is going up and seeking the Lord in his guidance and in this situation. And so that's the only opportunity or chance that David has. He's not going to be able to do it by himself for sure in this situation. He's going to be overwhelmed. So someone told him that Ahithophel was one of the conspirators, and David prayed to the Lord that the counsel of Ahithophel be turned into foolishness, and we'll see how that comes to pass in just a moment. He talks to Hushai the Archite, came to meet him with his coat rent, and David said, "Okay, I want you to go back to the city, and I want you to go back and tell him that you're going to be his servant, and I want you to help us to remedy this situation with Ahithophel." We're going to see more about that. So Ahithophel's an advisor to Absalom. He's the wisest person that David had advising him pretty much the whole time. And so all those times that David was fighting those battles and wars and all the rest of it, Ahithophel was his number one advisor. So he was right there with him. So he's a very, very smart person, and now he's on the side of Absalom. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and go to verse 16. See, we just covered 1/4 of everything to cover today. We have a lot to go through. Okay, So if someone would read 16, 1 through 14, that would be great. Okay. Thank you, Sister Debbie. So we're seeing more about David. So what do we notice about David? David he's in the moment. He's paying attention to what's going on. He may have been doing all kinds of other things that were distracting him from the kingdom before, but he certainly isn't doing that now. He is very focused on what he needs to do. He is on the run from Absalom. He knows that Absalom is going to make a run at the kingdom, and now he is fleeing. He's already fled across Kidron, and now in chapter 16 and verse 1, we see Ziba. And do we remember who Ziba was from before? Right, right, right. Saul's grandson. Yeah, right. So that was when David went out seeking relatives of Saul. He found Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was lame, and he had told Ziba and all of his people to be servants of Mephibosheth. And so here we are in verse 16 or chapter 16 and 1. We're seeing where Ziba has asses saddled and all kinds of provisions loaded onto it. And the king asks Ziba, what's the meaning of this? And he tells him, this is for all of your men, that they may eat and drink. And then he asked, he didn't say Mephibosheth by name in verse 3, but that's who he means. Where is thy master's son? And Ziba said unto the king, Behold, he abideth at Jerusalem, for he said, Today shall the house of Israel restore me to the kingdom of my father. So he's trying to make it sound like Mephibosheth is making a run with Absalom for the kingdom, which is not correct. And so you have all kinds of people here with all kinds of agendas. And here's Ziba doing something that's supporting David, but he has an agenda on what he's doing. And so just like David conspired the whole time with Bathsheba and Uriah and all those things that he did then, everybody's doing it now. Everybody that he works with is doing the same sort of thing with him. And so the Lord is paying him back for what he had done. And in this case, Ziba is bringing him things that he needs, but he's also speaking bad of Mephibosheth, and we'll see more about this later. And then we have Shimei, who is from the house of Saul, and he takes a pretty brazen approach and starts casting stones at David, which is obviously the penalty of that is the death penalty. But seemingly he doesn't care. He's more or less, seems like he's saying here, if you'd have just left Saul alone, he'd been just fine, and this whole situation wouldn't be in such a mess. And so David, instead of going with what his servant said, let's just kill him right now for his lack of respect, David interprets it that who knows, maybe the Lord sent him to be a messenger to him to more or less accuse David of all of the things that he had done. Not the things that he said specifically, but David is almost saying, yeah, if somebody needs to be yelling at me, I guess I probably deserve it. And so, and then in verse 11 he says, And David said to Abishai and to all his servants, Behold, my son, which came forth out of my bowels, seeketh my life. How much more now may this Benjamite do it? Let him alone, and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. So he's saying, how much more worse thing can you do than I have my son coming to take my life. This guy that's yelling at me, Lord may have sent him for all I know, and just let him be. Okay, so that gets us up to verse 15. If somebody would like to read verse 15 through 23. Okay, thanks, Brother Mike. So Hushai makes his big entrance, declaring his loyalty to Absalom and away from David. And so this is a pretty key thing, because we're going to see in a moment where Absalom is trusting Hushai's judgment. So this is pretty important. And then we also see where Ahithophel is asked in verse 20, give counsel among you what we shall do. And so he told them about going into the concubines. But if you go back and you look at what the Lord said to David on the judgment is he said that in the daytime, your, I forgot he said adversaries, whatever, will take your wives, like he's doing here. So this was prophesied by the Lord already before all this happened. And this is a very public display of Absalom preparing to take over the kingdom. And then in verse 23, and the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God, so was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. So he was that well known for his wisdom in all the situations that happened prior to this. Okay, we're in chapter 17. We're halfway. We're making it. We're making it. Okay. So if someone would like to read chapter 17, and we'll go all the way to, let's see. Okay, how about verse 12? How about 17, 1 through 12? Thank you, Sister Cheryl. That was a lot of reading. So now we're seeing what's happening. Absalom has got his group together, and they're trying to make a plan. They're in the last moments of taking over the kingdom. All they have to do is find David and kill David, and they're going to be good to go. At least that's what they think. And so they had already followed Ahithophel's advice with the concubines. Now, in the beginning of verse 17, he said unto Absalom, let me now choose out 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue after David this night. And then he said, I will smite the king only. This is in verse 2. And I'll bring back all the people just fine, and we'll have peace. And so in verse 4, The saying pleased Absalom well and the elders of Israel. So they had heard what Absalom had said, Ahithophel. They heard what Ahithophel had said, his wise counsel. Absalom liked it, and all the elders liked it. So what happened? This is when David's plan comes into place. So that's when Absalom calls Hushai, the Archite, and says, let us hear what he has to say. Okay, so now you've heard that every single person that they're talking to is in agreement on the plan, but they're trying to find out if Hushai's got another idea about this, and obviously he does have another idea about this because he's being led by the Lord. And so Hushai was come to Absalom. Absalom spoke unto him, saying, Ahithophel has spoken. Shall we do after his saying? If not, speak thou. And Hushai said to Absalom, the counsel that Ahithophel hath given is not good at this time. That's a qualifier, right? He didn't say Ahithophel doesn't know what he's talking about. He didn't say he's not a wise man. He's using very cunning words here to say his advice is not good at this time. And so it's less confrontational to say it that way. Hushai knows that. And so he says, hear now, for said Hushai, thou knowest thy father and his men, that they be mighty men, and they be chafed in their minds as a bear robbed of her whelps in the field, and thy father is a man of war, and will not lodge with the people. So now Hushai is talking to Absalom, saying, you know your father. He's the mightiest warrior that's ever lived. You think it's going to be that easy to take him in this situation? Have you not seen him fight before? That's really what he's saying. Behold, he is hid now in some pit, or in some other place, and it will come to pass, when some of them be overthrown at the first, that whosoever heareth it will say, there is a slaughter among the people that follow Absalom. So it's almost like he is saying in verse 9, he's using guerrilla warfare on him, that David would use guerrilla warfare because he knows how to hide. He knows how to get away from anybody. He got away from King Saul for the first half of his life, I guess you would say. And so he's saying you're going to have to take a different approach. And so in verse 11 he says, therefore I counsel that all Israel be generally gathered unto thee, from Dan even to Beersheba, as the sand that is by the sea for multitude, and that thou go to battle in thine own person. So remember Ahithophel's plan? Ahithophel's plan was that he was going to kill David. Well, what would happen if he killed David? Then he'd be the mightiest warrior that lived because he killed the mightiest warrior that lived. Now Absalom is thinking, I think I want to be the mightiest warrior that lived. I think I want to be the one to kill David. So this is, you can start seeing human nature taking over here. And Absalom is thinking, okay, we're going down to verse 14 now. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel, for the Lord hath appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom. Okay? So we got the plan. The plan is in place. In verse 15, then Hushai tells the priests, to Zadok and Abiathar the priest, what's going on, and he tells them to send quickly to David the message that they've got to pass over the river Jordan. And they've got to do that like immediately with all the people that they have. And so that message goes out. There's a little bit of intrigue there where somebody sees this message being passed along, and Absalom's servants try to track down the priest, but they're not able to do it. So they're able to escape, and they're able to provide the information to David. Then in verse 22, this is 17:22, then David arose and all the people that were with him, and they passed over Jordan by the morning light. There lacked not one of them that was not gone over Jordan. Verse 23, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his ass and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city, put his household in order, and hanged himself and died, and was buried in the sepulchre of his father. So Ahithophel was smart enough to know that the plan was going to fail and that the Lord was in it, and so he killed himself. And then in verse 24 through 28, this is where David goes across and, Okay, so this is where Absalom makes Amasa the captain of the host instead of Joab, because Joab was with David. And in verse 27, this is when Shobi, the son of Nahash, Machir, the son of Amiel, and Barzillai, the Gileadite, brought beds and basins and earthen vessels and wheat and barley. So they resupplied all of David's forces. So David didn't carry very much with him. They were on the run. And so they got all the food and all the resources that they needed. It was exactly at the timing that they needed it. Now we're up to chapter 18. Yeah, we have no time left. So what happens is they're basically going into the wilderness. So now it's a lot more like guerrilla warfare because there's no advantage of a horse in thick woods. And so if you think of armies that are battling each other on a large plain, it's really about numbers. It's really about projecting force. It's about strength. It's about horses and chariots, all those things. If you're in a thick forest and you can't see very far in front of you, then that's not about that. In fact, you can't even really ride a horse very effectively or a chariot or anything in the woods. And so David knew all this, and so that's why they went there. Let's see, I'll find it here. Okay, so in verse 6, 18 and 6. So the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim, where the people of Israel were slain before the servants of David, and there was a great slaughter that day of 20,000 men. For the battle was there scattered over the face of all the country, and the wood devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. So what does that mean? That meant they were in disarray. It meant I'm imagining David and his men, they're doing all kinds of things. They're digging pits, or for the pits that exist, they're covering them over with leaves and branches, and they're doing every single thing they can to use the woods against those that are there. And then verse 9, Absalom met the servants of David, and he rode upon a mule, and the mule went under a thick bough of great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and was taken up between the heaven and the earth. And the mule that was under him went away, and a certain man saw it and told Joab. So what happened is, they said when Absalom got a haircut, 5 pounds of hair was cut off of his head when he got a haircut once a year. And so he had a huge, big head of hair, and he rode underneath this tree, and his hair got caught up in the tree. And the mule kept going, so he was there hanging there completely helpless. And so if we kept reading, we'd see that Joab actually killed Absalom. And at the end of this whole thing, the king was very upset. In verse 33, he went over to the gate and wept, and as he said, "Thus so, O my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son." And so, even though the whole rebellion is put down, Absalom is killed, David is upset because this is his son, but the kingdom is saved. So that was a lot. Thank you for your patience. It's a lot of material to try to cover, especially in verse 18. If you get a chance, you may want to read it because I did miss some good stuff in there. Thanks, everybody.